And I'm sure, every watch is going to be different. But if I was to say to you, how long does it take to hand make one of your watches? Is there a sort of ballpark time?
It's a long process. It's probably about 2 years in total. So 2 years from the initial conversations with the client, ironing out the specification that they're wanting in the watch, and once we've sorted out that sort of all that specification, then it's a matter of ordering all the materials to make the watch. So we order the raw materials, the gold, the platinum, the nickel silver, the steels for the watch, and the build really starts from there. So it's a very long process.
So the client themselves, they do actually have an input in how the watch is going to be at the end?
Very much so. Some people, they like to have a bit of them in there. So obviously it's a variation on my theme, but they can choose maybe engraving or case material or different sort of styles of finishing and so on. Ultimately, it's my watch. It's got to be within my sort of limitations, but they all like to have a little bit of input.
Has anyone asked you for anything completely outrageous?
No, I think. Many years ago, perhaps. There were odd requests, but
go on, tell us some.
No. We've never had to put Mickey Mouse hands on a watch, but
are you referring to my Jungle Book watch?
It's very nice. It's a handsome watch.
Do you know, poor Roger, bless him, I'm sure that everyone that meets him does exactly what both Stu and I did and hides the watch that they're wearing, because you must have that from people who just think, but you're not judging what people are wearing, are you?
Not at all, no. Watches are, you can have a very nice watch which costs several pounds from the local petrol station going up to, one of George's watches. One of his sold recently for over 3 million. So, it's there's room for everyone. That's the great thing about watches.
Now we'll come to George in just a moment, but I'm intrigued to know then how a young boy growing up in Bolton in the 70s and 80s decides he wants to be a watchmaker.
Yes, well, I didn't know really. That was the thing. So, fortunately, I was always very practical at school, very practical, and didn't really understand school. But my father was sort of, I think he was very good. He understood my limitations, I suppose, and he sort of pushed me in the practical direction. And he heard about a course in Manchester, which was clock and watch repairing. And he suggested I went on that, and it really was a turning point for me.
And was it sort of an instant thing when you started looking at watches? Did you just immediately think, oh, this just fits me?
Oh, yes, without a doubt. The very first day at college was, for me, the best day of education. Up until that point, I remember, school was, I remember sitting through lesson after lesson in a total dream, really. It just didn't click at all. And didn't make sense. I didn't really understand the purpose of it. But the first day at college, for me, suddenly my world had begun, and that was it. And I was hooked. Really was hooked.
And obviously, you have come so far anyway since meeting the late Dr. George Daniels, but he does play a very significant part in your story. So we'll talk about him just for a little bit now. But I'm intrigued to know when you first became aware of him, and actually, when did you actually realise quite how important he was?
I first met him when I was at this college in Manchester, and he visited the students. The day before we heard that this man, George Daniels, was coming to visit us. I didn't know who George Daniels was. Somebody told me that he made handmade watches, but I didn't believe that was possible, because I'd been surrounded by watches which had been made in the watch industry by mass production. Anyway, so the next day George Daniels arrived, walked in through the door. He's wearing this incredible 3-piece pinstripe suit, superb quality shoes, and I thought, this man, there's something about him who's very special. And I eventually asked what was on the end of this pocket watch chain, which was fixed to his waistcoat, and out came this pocket watch called a Space Traveller. And it was at that moment that I sort of realised that there's greatness in front of me, and that was it. That's all I ever have wanted to do since, is to make watches by hand. So.
And he was really completely unique, wasn't he? And that he was the only person, I think, to initially in his time, to learn all of the skills necessary to make the watch.
That's right. So when he had ideas for the advancement of the mechanical timekeeper back in the late 1960s, the watchmaking industry in Britain was on its knees. It was virtually disappeared. So he had to learn I think there were 32 trades involved in the creation of a single pocket watch, and he had to master each of these. So case making, dial making, wheel making, plate making, escapement making, the list goes on. It's a huge list, and he perfected every single one of these skills, and that enabled him to create these extraordinary watches.
Because it would have been teams of people sort of on each sort of different skill, wouldn't it?
Yeah,
previously?
it was. Yes, it's very much a cottage industry, and just focusing on individual items, really.
So then you took it upon yourself to think, do you know what? I'm going to learn from this man. Tell us what happened next.
So I was bowled over by him, and again, my father sort of stepped in and bought me a copy of Watchmaking, which is this book written by George, which tells you how to build a watch from start to finish. So he bought me this book for a Christmas present, and I read the book cover to cover, and I think I read it 3 or 4 times. And by the end of it, I was beginning to think that, well, if George could make a watch, well, surely I could make a watch. And that's where it sort of started, and the start of a very long journey.
And it is a beautiful story, and it is documented, sort of considerably. And there is a lovely film. Dave Armstrong made a lovely film, Watchmaker's Apprentice, all about that. And we'll come back to that in a moment, because it's sort of remained part of your story, that movie itself. But do you remember then that moment when you finally mastered even just sort of the notion of getting a watch to tick for the first time?
Yes, I mean, the first watch was, when you actually sit down and begin to make a watch, it's a terrifying, daunting prospect, partly because nobody, apart from George, had ever really done it. So I built a small workshop in the garage at home with my parents, and kitted it out with some equipment and began making this watch. But even when I was making the components, I still had no idea that it would tick at the end. Anyway, about 18 months later, it came to the moment where it was about to tick, and it did tick, but it only just ticked. The quality wasn't quite right, and the finishing wasn't quite right. So it was a big step forward, really, because at least I'd got past that first hurdle, and really it was the start of the next sort of big journey, really, to perfect all those skills and crafts and so on to make a super watch. That was the challenge.
The sense of achievement in doing that must have been enormous.
Well, yes, I suppose it.
Well, what age were you?
I was 19 then, and but I had this watch which just about ticked, and yes, I was obviously delighted, but I wanted to make a really great watch. I was aware that it wasn't as good as it could have been, so that was the next challenge, to build a watch which would be accepted, something that hopefully at some stage I could sell as well. Ultimately you've got to make it pay. So that was the start of another big journey.
And then eventually you did move to the Isle of Man, and you became, as the film is called, The Watchmaker's Apprentice, and you've obviously come so far since then, and that's what we're going to talk about over the course of this next hour or so.